Maybe you've heard someone say, go out there and make a name for yourself. Or maybe someone has simply said about himself, I just want to make a name for myself. They're talking about doing something great, doing something that will cause their name to be remembered. And this has been a priority for people throughout history. People want to see their name in lights. They want to hear their name praised. They want to build monuments to themselves. They want their name to live forever. Now in Chicago, there's the Sears Tower. Actually, there isn't. Ironically, the building is still there, but it now has a different name on it. It's now a monument to someone else's name. The Sears Tower was built, when it was built to be the tallest building in the world. And it was built as a monument to the Sears name. But, like I said, now it's a monument to someone else's name. I can't even remember who he is. Willis. There you go. But building towers isn't anything new. In fact, in Genesis 11, we read about the Tower of Babel. It was another monument to self. But none of these towers will last forever. And here's the real problem with these towers, with these monuments. Even though there would be no life apart from God, though there would be nothing without God, people seek significance and seek worth and seek a name for themselves apart from God. And secondly, we really should be seeking to exalt God, God's name, not our own. We want to make a big deal about Him, not me. Now, don't get me wrong. We can do great things, and we can make an impact on our world. But we don't do it to draw attention to ourselves or to my name. We live for God. Our lives ought to be a monument to God's name. But now I'm running ahead, so let's back up and look at the text. Look at chapter 10 and verse 1. Genesis chapter 10, verse 1. It begins, "These are the generations of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Sons were born to them after the flood," and it will continue on telling this genealogy. And so this is the beginning of the fourth section of Genesis. It's the generations or the account of Noah's sons. Now earlier, God had blessed Adam and Eve and told them to multiply and fill the earth. And then he blessed Noah after the flood and told people to swarm the earth. In other words, to fill it. People all over, fill it with people. Now this section that we're looking at today in chapter 10, this genealogy tells us it tells us of the filling of the earth with people and of all the nations living under God's blessing. You see, all people of the world are presented here as a large extended family, which they are, which we are. And all people of the world are living under God's blessing. You see, theologians speak of a thing called God's common grace. It's grace that is given to all people. It refers to things like the sunshine, or the rain falls on both the righteous and the wicked. It's God gives good to all people. It's God's common grace. But here, the specific common grace is the blessing of having children and of continued life. See, God blessed people with the ability to reproduce and told them to multiply. And as we read this, we see people still exist. And the population is growing. This is God's grace. All people are living under God's blessing. And so we come to this genealogy. Now, don't tune me out because you heard the word genealogy. There are some important things here. The Tower of Babel story is in the first part of chapter 11, but it is purposely right in the middle of two genealogies. We won't spend a lot of time in the genealogy, but we need to take a look at it. There are some, these are more than just birth records. They teach us about God and his working in the world. And so the first genealogy tells us about the origin of all the different nations on earth. Then the tower story fills in the details. It tells us kind of like what happened, how it happened, why it happened. Then the second genealogy tells us of a special chosen family line. So let's keep reading. Look at verse 2, chapter 10, verse 2. It says, the sons of Japheth, Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshech, and Tiras. The sons of Gomer, Ashkenaz, Riphtah, and Togarmah. The sons of Javan, Elisha, Tarshish, Kittim, and Dodanim. From these, the coastland people spread in their lands, each with his own language, by their clans, in their nations. And the genealogy continues like that. But he starts with the youngest of Noah's sons. Why start with the youngest? Well, he's going to work backwards. It seems he's working backwards because he's starting with the youngest and getting to the oldest, Shem, who was blessed by Noah. And so we're not told much about Japheth's descendants. Probably maybe because they lived further away from Israel and had less interaction with Israel. But we're just given these names. They're there, those are the nations. But notice the phrase at the end of the verses we read in verse 5. It says, but each with his own language. He's pointing out the different languages here. This is an introduction to an important theme of this section. Well, then in verses 6 through 20, it tells of Ham's line. And remember, it was Ham's son Canaan that was cursed by Noah. So Ham's descendants are like the Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Philistines, the Canaanites. These are all familiar names to us as we've read through the Bible, because they have had a lot of interaction with Israel. They have affected Israel's culture and they affected Israel's livelihood and their politics and Israel's ungodly religious practices. They fought battles against Israel, and a couple of these nations even conquered Israel and took them into exile. But as a whole, Ham's descendants were ungodly and rebellious culture. They were reminiscent of Cain's line. Well, let's look at verse 8 through 11. It gives some specific details about some people or one person in Ham's line. Verse 8 says, Cush fathered Nimrod. He was the first on the earth to be a mighty man or a warrior. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore, it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter or mighty warrior before the Lord. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. From that land he went into Assyria and built Nineveh, Rehoboth, Calah, and Rezon, and it continues on. But this little extended section talking about Nimrod gives us some details about him. We are told that he was great before the Lord. In other words, this is a superlative, and it suggests that even God recognized Nimrod's greatness or his strength, his capability. However, it doesn't suggest that God approved of what he did. But Nimrod was well known, and he became proverbial. In other words, they used his name talking about situations. Oh, he's like Nimrod. Not the way we would use Nimrod today, but he was like Nimrod, a great hunter or a great warrior. When people talked about being like Nimrod, it was kind of like today you might say he gave a Herculean effort, or you might say he was a Hulk of a man. The only difference is that Nimrod was a real person. And so maybe it'd be more like saying this was a real David and Goliath story, being like David or like Goliath. But this is explained. Why did Nimrod stand out? He was a mighty man, a hunter, a warrior. But that might strike you as odd. Everyone was family. Why would you need a warrior? I mean, you shouldn't really. But Nimrod stands out as an aggressor. He's an empire builder. And his name means we shall rebel. It's fitting because his empire was opposed to God. And this foreshadows what will happen with the Tower of Babel. Well, then in verses 21 through 31, it tells of Shem's line. And I just want to point out two things here. Look at verse 21. It says, to Shem also, the father of all the children of Eber, the eldest brother of Japheth, children were born. The children of Eber are the Hebrews. And so Abraham and all of Israel are in Shem's line. But he doesn't say anything about that just yet. But then jump down, look at verse 25. He says, to Eber were born two sons. The name of the one was Peleg, for in his days the earth was divided, and his brother's name was Joktan. Now, notice that Eber has two sons. One is Peleg, and his name means division. It was during his lifetime that the earth, the nations were divided, which is what we'll see in the next chapter. This foreshadows what happens at the Tower of Babel. But also, at this point in the genealogy, the family tree splits. We're told about Joktan and his descendants, but nothing more about Peleg. Not yet, anyway. We'll just have to wait a bit. But this genealogy here in verse 10 rounds out with 70 nations. And the number 70 suggests completeness, or that this is all people. So all the nations came from Noah. And this is the point of the genealogy. Look at verse 32. These are the clans of the sons of Noah, according to their genealogies in their nations, and from these nations spread abroad on the earth after the flood. So, all people, all nations of the world are related. We're all one family going back to Noah. And all people experience God's blessing, his common grace of continued life. But this also means that all people are dependent on God and are under his rule, as Noah was. And so God is sovereign over all people, whether they recognize it or not. So no matter your race, no matter your nationality, or where you grew up, there is one God. And all people are under his rule and are accountable to him and owe him worship. But people have a bad habit, and it's been seen throughout history, but they have a bad habit of rejecting God and elevating themselves. Look at chapter 11 and verse 1. Now, the whole earth had one language and the same words. Now, this first verse is doing two things. First, the genealogy that we just read pointed out 3 times, we only saw it once, we didn't read the other 2 times, but 3 times pointed out that the different nations had their own languages. And so this statement here at the beginning of chapter 11 says that all people had the same language, the same words. And so the coming verses will explain how the various languages came about and why. But this statement about them having the same language also explains what unified them. They were a single group with the same words, they spoke the same way, and that kept them connected. Verse 2. And as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. Now, this is also significant. So after the flood, the people migrated together. So as a group, they all moved. And they all settled together in one place. Now, what did God tell them to do? He said, multiply and fill the earth. Spread out over the whole earth. But they settled in one place. They settled in one place in opposition to God's command. Verse 3. Then they said, that's verse 4, verse 3. And they said to one another, come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. Then they said, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. And let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth. So they decide to make bricks and build a city and a tower. Now, we're given some important details. First, we're told that they made these bricks, and they had, it says they had bricks for stone and bitumen or tar for mortar. This is simply explaining the building techniques to people who normally built with stone, and they didn't understand about bricks and those kind of things. So it's explaining those building techniques to people who usually build with stone. But then we see that they want to build a city. Now, why? What are cities built for? Cities were built for protection. Usually, protection from the outside, so people couldn't come in and attack you or take over you. But here, it seems to be to protect their unity, to hold them all together, to keep them together in defiance of God. And they want to build a tower. And they describe this tower in one way. It has its top in the heavens. Now, I remember as a kid seeing a picture, and I'm pretty sure it was a flannel graph. But I remember seeing a picture of this really tall, kind of skinny tower. It looked kind of unstable, a little shaky. But it says that its top was in the tower. In the heavens. But in the heavens doesn't necessarily mean really, 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 really high. There's more to it. This is most likely describing what is called a ziggurat. A ziggurat is a man-made mountain with a temple at the top. It's a large stepped mountain made out of bricks. You might be familiar with the Aztec temples. You've seen pictures of Aztec temples with all the steps up to the top, and at the top they had like a little temple or a place where they did sacrifices. those are a type of ziggurat. But these mountain temples were thought to join heaven and earth. The top of them, in the ancient Near East, the top of them were often painted blue, so they blended in with the sky. And so it was like the top of them joined or became a part of heaven. It was in heaven. The top was considered to be in heaven, in the domain of the gods. And they thought it gave them access to heaven and to the gods. They were attempting to enter into God's domain. But why did they build this city and this tower? Well, they told us. They say why. First, they say it's to make a name for themselves. So this was a prideful monument to self. It was an elevation of society over God. They were determined to do things their own way. They were seeking a fame for themselves rather than giving glory to God. And they were seeking significance apart from God. And people still do this. In fact, the Apostle Paul explains in Romans 1 that people are in the business of making idols. That they reject the true God and exalt themselves and other things of their own choosing rather than God. People refuse to acknowledge God and to submit to Him and will be held accountable for that. They're without excuse. But the other reason to build this city and this tower is so they won't be scattered. In other words, it's direct rebellion against God. I want you to think about this. They announced what they want to do and why. Have you ever announced your disobedience before doing it? Now, don't answer too quickly. Have you ever said the words, or something like the words, I'm going to go in there and give him a piece of my mind? I'm going to go over there and fill in the blank. If you ever hear yourself announcing your sin before you do it, stop. Let that be a notice to yourself. I'm thinking wrong. This is not what I should be doing. If you hear yourself announce your sin, stop. Well, let's keep reading. Verse 5. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower, which the children of man had built. Now, there's some irony here, and you could say it's a little humorous. And so we're told here that God came down to see this. Now, what did they say they were doing? Building a tower up into heaven. And so this magnificent tower that's reaching into heaven really isn't so magnificent either. God still has to come down to see it. It's small and insignificant compared to God. But also, the thing is God already knows what they're doing. But this coming to see it expresses his justice. You see, he's investigating before judging. It's showing that he's paying attention, that he knows what's happening, and his judgment is just. Verse 6. And the Lord said, behold, they are one people, and they have all one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do. And nothing that they propose will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down there and confuse their language so that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord dispersed them from there over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth. And from there the Lord dispersed them over the face of all the earth. Notice God says that nothing will be impossible for them. You see, this tower is a sign of humanity's refusal to live within God-given boundaries. They want to do their own thing, and they are dead set on it. They are unified by language, and together as one group, they will continue to live in defiance of God. They'll never stop. And so God announces his decision. He will scatter them. God disperses them over all the earth. This is the exact opposite of what the people wanted, what their plan was. Their plan was to settle and stay together. But God makes them do what he had told them to do. Now, how does he do it? By confusing their languages. And notice he changes all their words so they can't understand each other. They can't talk. I don't know if you've ever tried to accomplish a task with someone who speaks a different language than you. I know some of you have. Once I was working I was building a large patio, a really nice patio, behind this really nice house. And one of the guys who was working with us spoke Spanish. Now, I know a little bit of Spanish, and probably more now than I did then. But I was working with him, and it was difficult. And he didn't speak any English. And so it was difficult. Now, I learned a few new words like hammer, Mateo. You know, I learned a few words like up, down, and, those kinds of things. And we were able to work together slowly, but it wasn't easy. It's definitely not efficient. And it can get frustrating. So once these people at Babel, once they can't understand each other and they can't communicate, they just quit. The work stops. And the people who speak the same language, they gather together into their little groups, and eventually they all move away into different areas. And then this place where they were building this tower, where their languages were confused, is called Babel, also known as Babylon. But Babylon will later become a proud city, and they claim to be the center of the world. And it was part of Nimrod's empire, who we just talked about. And it was opposed to God. And they said their name, Babel, meant gate of the gods. But the book of Genesis, God's word, gives it a different meaning. In Hebrew, Babel means confusion. It's kind of like saying, you think you're so great? You're not. It's a place of confusion, not a place of the gods. But God humbled the proud at Babel. And they were powerful, and they were self-sufficient, and they were unified in trying to make a name for themselves and to honor themselves. But in spite of all their pride and all their ambition, God simply changed their words, and they couldn't do anything together any longer. But I want to make it clear. It's not the building of cities or technological advances that God has an issue with here. That it's not the building of cities or technology that displeases God. What displeases him is the pride and arrogance that rejects God and tries to live as if he's not God, as if we don't have to obey him and that we are not accountable to him. But the thing is, much of our society lives this way, as if they don't need God, as if there is no God. And they will even try to tell other people that there is no God. And they will live their own way and do their own thing, and they basically make themselves God, and they obey themselves. And they build monuments to themselves, monuments to humanity. And people live as if I am most important. And we put ourselves in God's place. But that is deluded arrogance. And it's this pride that is the beginning of sin. When we say, I know better than God, and I don't have to listen to him. When we choose our way over God's, that's what we're doing. And that's incredibly arrogant. But there is a better way. The better way is to humble yourself and honor God. And it's not just better because it's right, but it's also very practical. James 4:6 says, God opposes the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. So God opposes the proud, works against. He is actively opposed to the arrogant, the proud, but gives grace to the humble. That means you can either run into God, or you could be helped by him. Now I want you to imagine a 5-year-old, small little 5-year-old, and then a 300-pound NFL lineman. Would that 5-year-old want to be on the other team and try to run through that NFL lineman? Or would he rather have that NFL lineman block for him so he could run through? It's pretty obvious, right? I one time ran into a friend of mine who was just a kid. Well, he was 18, 19, but he was solid, and I'm not a small guy. I ran into him and fell on the ground. Okay? We'll take that 5-year-old and put him up against the lineman. The choice is obvious. The choice is clear. Would you rather have God work against you or be for you? God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. But here's the amazing thing. God knew that humanity would continue to resist him. But he still loves us. And God chose to redeem people. Look at verse 10. It says, these are the generations of Shem. When Shem was 100 years old, he fathered Arpachshad 2 years after the flood. And then the genealogy continues. And so we've returned to this genealogy of Shem's family. But it's a little different than the previous part. See, earlier he got to Peleg. He mentioned Peleg, and then everything stopped. It didn't talk anymore about Peleg. It just went on to discuss his brother's descendants. But now we're going to see Peleg's branch of the family tree. So look down at verse 16. When Eber had lived 34 years, he fathered Peleg. Jump down to verse 18. When Peleg had lived 30 years, he fathered Reu. In verse 20. When Reu had lived 32 years, he fathered Serug. 22. When Serug had lived 30 years, he fathered Nahor. In verse 24. When Nahor had lived 29 years, he fathered Terah. In verse 26. When Terah had lived 70 years, he fathered Abraham, Nahor, and Haran. And so we end up with these 3 brothers. And one of them is very significant. God will call Abram, who he will later rename Abraham, for a special purpose. You see, it's from Abraham's descendants that Israel will come. And it's from Israel that Jesus will come. And it's through Jesus that people will be saved from their sins and reconciled to God. The line of Shem through Peleg, it's separated from the rest of the genealogy. And that disconnects them from the judgment at Babel, and it connects them with God's redemption. God had a plan to save us, and he didn't let anything stop his plan. Even though our natural inclination is to do our own thing, to disobey God, and to seek to honor ourselves, even though we are sinners who oppose God rather than him, God still made a way for us to be saved, for us to be reconciled, and to live in right relationship with him. Romans 5:8 says, but God demonstrated his love for us in that while we were still sinners, while we were still opposed to God, while we were still seeking our own glory and not his, while we were sinners, Christ died for us. Jesus came and died for us so we could come into a right relationship with God and live to honor him. Building towers isn't the answer. Building monuments to self isn't what life is about. Life is about God, and we live to honor God. He is God. He created us. He gave us life. And through Jesus, he gave new life, eternal life, to all who believe in Jesus. He is worthy of all praise. We owe him our lives and our respect and our obedience. And Jesus is the name above all names. But for some reason, our tendency is to try to make names for ourselves, to elevate, exalt our own names. We want honor for ourselves, and we build monuments to ourselves, to man. How about we make a big deal about Jesus instead? How about we honor God instead? Let's live lives of faithful obedience to God. Let's humble ourselves and praise our God. And let's find our significance and our worth and our purpose, not in worldly achievements, but in God. Let your life be a monument, a testimony to the grace and greatness of God.